When we first moved to PE, I stayed with my gran for a short period of time while my mum was sorting out the move from the Free State down to PE. I was in grade 3, or standard 1 as it was called back then, and my aunt was in matric. One morning, my gran woke us up to get up ready for school. My aunt was chased out of bed. Teenage girls want their sleep. And we were all rushed to get ready with the usual morning chaos. It was only when we were about to leave that my gran noticed how dark it still was outside. Somehow she'd woken us all up an hour too early. Well, my teenage aunt was not at all impressed. Advent reminds us that timing matters. Not God's timing, which is always perfect, but our readiness to meet God. We might not know the hour, but we can wake our hearts and minds to hope and to being ready. Today we enter the season of Advent, a season of waiting and watching and hoping. And our focus today is on hope awakened. Advent isn't simply about counting down to Christmas. It's not an Advent calendar. It's a time for our hearts to awaken to the promise of God. A hope that reaches beyond the noise and the fear and the busyness of our world. And our readings today give us 4 invitations: to see the mountain vision of peace and justice, to live in the urgency of now, to watch and wait with faithful expectation, and to find hope and joy in God's presence with us. Together they remind us that hope isn't passive, it's active, it stirs us, it challenges us, it calls us to live life differently. And so we'll be looking at each of our readings for today and seeing how that call to hope is expressed and how it challenges us. Firstly, we look at Isaiah, where he speaks to a people living in a world not unlike ours, a world of political unrest, of moral uncertainty, and conflict between nations. And the prophet writes during a time when Israel and Judah were caught between powerful empires, Assyria and Babylon and Egypt. Fear and oppression and injustice were daily realities. And it's against this backdrop that Isaiah lifts his gaze to a horizon far beyond the immediate troubles of his own day. He envisions the mountain of the Lord's temple, rising above all the other mountains, a symbol of God's sovereignty and eternal rule. And this mountain isn't merely a physical place, but a representation of God's kingdom, a place where God's justice and peace prevail, a place that draws people from every nation to learn God's ways. And in this vision, swords are turned into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks, tools for cultivation rather than instruments for destruction. What Isaiah describes is nothing less than a radical transformation of society, where God's justice and mercy govern human relationships, and violence is replaced by reconciliation. This vision is deeply hopeful because it reminds us that God's plans are far bigger than ours, and far bigger than our crises, bigger than our failures, bigger than all the chaos of our world. It also carries a moral invitation. The nations stream to God's mountain because they're willing to be shaped by his wisdom. Hope is awakened not just by the promise of God's reign, but by the call to participate in it. For us today, Isaiah's mountain is a reminder that hope isn't passive. In a world fractured by injustice and inequality and conflict, God's vision still challenges us to imagine something better. It urges us to align ourselves with God's purposes, to seek peace and pursue justice and welcome reconciliation. Even when the present seems dark, the mountain of the Lord still rises, steadfast, unshakable, and inviting all of us to journey toward it. This is the hope that Advent awakens, a vision of a world renewed by God's love, where the impossible becomes possible, and where our faithfulness today is part of the unfolding of God's future. And then we move on to Paul's letter to the Romans. His words are quite striking. The night is nearly over, the day is almost here. Now, to understand this, we need to remember the context. The early Christian communities lived in a world that was morally, politically, and spiritually challenging. They faced persecution, social pressures, and temptations that could lull them into spiritual complacency. Paul reminds them that time is short. The final dawn, Christ's return, is approaching. And Advent hope calls us to a similar awareness. Waiting for Christ's coming isn't a passive or distant hope. It's an active wakefulness, a call to examine our lives, our priorities, and the ways in which we reflect God's love in the world. The night that Paul speaks of represents ignorance and sin and complacency, things that can cloud our vision and dull our hearts. But the day is near. The light of Christ is breaking into our lives, calling us to live in truth and righteousness and in love. Waiting can easily lull us into spiritual sleep. We can tell ourselves, well, I'll be faithful tomorrow. I'll prepare my heart later. But Advent says, wake up. The time is now. This urgency isn't meant to frighten us, but it is meant to stir us. How are we living as children of the day? Are we attentive to the needs around us? Are we generous in our service? Are we faithful in our giving? Truthful in our speech? Compassionate in our relationships? Advent invites us to put aside behaviors and attitudes that belong to the darkness, grudges, indifference, selfishness, and to embrace the way of light, of Christ. Hope awakened is hope that acts. It doesn't sit idly by while injustice persists or while our hands grow cold. Practically, this could mean small intentional actions, making time for prayer and reflection, reaching out to someone in need, choosing honesty over convenience, or speaking words of encouragement in our families and workplaces and communities. Hope awakened in Advent is a hope that transforms our daily living, reminding us that the future that God promises begins here in the now. And then we move to our gospel reading, where Jesus' warning that no one knows the day or hour reminds us that life is unpredictable. Historically, his audience faced uncertainty and instability. They were under Roman rule, experiencing oppression, and with the memory of exile still fresh in their hearts. This warning also isn't meant to frighten them, but to cultivate readiness and trust. Advent is a season of watchfulness, but notice how Jesus frames it, not with anxiety, but with hope. Being watchful is an active waiting, alert to God's presence, responsive to opportunities for service, attentive to the needs of the world. The watchfulness Jesus describes isn't passive or fearful. It's grounded in trust that God's promises are sure. We live in a culture that emphasizes control and planning and certainty. I know I certainly prefer that. But Advent reminds us that ultimate control is God's alone. Our call is to stay awake spiritually, to nurture our faith, to live ethically, to embody Christ's love in tangible ways. Watchfulness is hopeful because it trusts God's timing. It's not about paranoia, but about preparation. Jesus calls us to live each day as if he could come at any moment, noticing opportunities to love and to serve and to reconcile. It's hope in motion, active and vibrant. Being ready means living intentionally every day so that when Christ comes, whether in the final day or in ordinary moments or in unexpected ways, we're aligned with his purposes. Think of a gardener who tends his plants carefully, knowing that the harvest time is uncertain. But the gardener waters and prunes and nourishes daily, trusting that growth is happening, even if it's not immediately visible. And so it is with Advent hope. Our faithful, watchful living shapes a future that we can't fully see, but one we know that God will bring to fruition. Advent calls us to live expectantly, to act responsibly, and to trust faithfully, confident that hope awakens in those who stay awake in God's light. And our final text this morning is Psalm 122. It's a song of pilgrimage, written for worshippers ascending to Jerusalem, the city of the Lord. I was glad when they said to me, "Let us go to the house of the Lord." This psalm reflects not only physical movement, but spiritual orientation, a turning of the heart towards God. In the midst of uncertainty and political unrest or personal anxiety, the psalmist finds hope simply by being in the presence of God. And Advent isn't only about longing, it's about finding joy in God's nearness. This theme resonates deeply with Isaiah's mountain vision. The mountain of the Lord is a place not only of justice, but of peace and divine presence. Hope is awakened when we remember that God isn't distant. God dwells with us in our worship, in our prayer, in the communities where we gather, and in the ordinary rhythms of our daily lives. We don't wait alone. We wait together as a people who are called to sing and to pray and to celebrate God's enduring love. Advent reminds us that the ultimate hope of God's kingdom is rooted in God's presence now, even as we anticipate the fullness to come. And this speaks to that biblical concept of Emmanuel, God with us, which we looked at in our Nicene Creed series. The anticipation of Advent isn't a longing for a God who is far away. It's a joyful expectation of the God who comes near. The psalmist rejoices in the journey towards the temple, and we too rejoice in our journey towards Christ, who embodies God's presence fully. Hope awakens when we recognize that God's nearness is a source of guidance and of refuge and of renewal. Even in the waiting of Advent, hope isn't passive longing, but active, joyful expectation. It invites us to trust that God is already at work in the world, shaping hearts, renewing communities, and calling us to be instruments of peace and justice. The candle of hope that we light this first Sunday of Advent is a reminder that God's presence lights our path, giving courage to persevere, faith to endure, and joy to celebrate, even amid uncertainty. Hope in God's presence is the assurance that we're not alone in our waiting. The God who promised peace and justice and redemption is already near. He's already walking with us, sustaining us, and calling us to align our lives with His divine vision. It's this hope that awakens our hearts this Advent and carries us forward with expectancy and joy. So how do we live out this hope awakened in our daily lives? Advent isn't only a season of waiting. It's meant to be a season of active hope, a hope that shapes the way we think and act and respond to the world around us. So firstly, let's see that mountain vision. Isaiah invites us to imagine a world transformed by God's justice and peace. Let this vision inspire the way we live today, in our prayers and our decisions, in how we treat each other. When we act with integrity and pursue reconciliation or work for justice, we participate in bringing a small part of that mountain of hope into our world. And secondly, Advent calls us to wake from spiritual sleep. Paul reminds us the night is nearly over, the day is almost here. That's a call to live with purpose, to examine our hearts and our habits, to put aside attitudes and actions that belong to the darkness. It means making time for prayer and reaching out to someone in need, or choosing honesty and kindness in situations where it's perhaps easier to remain indifferent. It's an active, daily choice. And thirdly, we're called to be watchful. Jesus tells us that no one knows the hour, and that's a call to be vigilant, not fearful. To be watchful means being attentive to God's work in our lives and in the lives of those around us. It's about noticing opportunities to serve and to love and to forgive and to encourage. Like a gardener tending those plants, our faithful attention nurtures the growth of hope, even if the outcome isn't immediately visible. And finally, Advent reminds us to rejoice in God's presence. Remember Psalm 122. We're reminded that hope is awakened when we encounter God, in worship, in prayer, in our communities, in the ordinary rhythms of our daily life. God's presence reassures us, strengthens us, and calls us to live with courage and joy, even if the times seem uncertain. In this Advent season, may our hope awaken, not just in expectation of what is to come, but in the ways we live and serve and rejoice in God's presence today. Let us step forward with hearts that are ready and alert and alive to God's transforming love. Come, Lord Jesus, awaken our hearts with hope, strengthen our faith, stir us to live as children of the day, ready, alert, and expectant for your coming. Amen.